atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where all the swinging youngsters are singing the immortal 1963 Beach Boys classic, Bum 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 Iran. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea, especially if your ship is in the Strait of Hormuz. Welcome to the Blast Radius. We are just elated to have you with us tonight, but of course that goes without saying. Full disclosure right at the top, yes, I know I already did an Iran-specific field guide 6 or 7 weeks ago, but that was more of a 30,000-foot view of the last 1,000 years of assorted Persian and Iranian despotisms. But given the events of the last 48 hours, circumstances would seem to demand that we revisit that same topic once again. Where we normally open the aperture tonight, we are narrowing it just a little bit. We're focusing exclusively on the 47-year history of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic. Pick your term you prefer, I guess, and giving a detailed accounting of its collected misdeeds. Because when the day arrives that the United States is killing your leadership and decapitating your regime in the hopes of creating a power vacuum that gets filled by somebody else, anybody else, that didn't just happen by random accident. You had to earn that. But this will actually be the end of... Will it be the end of the Islamic Revolution, or will it find a way to hang on and retrench itself and persist for another 47 years? Maybe another 47 years after that? It's impossible to say, obviously, but the answer, when we have it, will do much toward determining whether this military action was a wise or an unwise thing to have undertaken. But for our purposes here, we will treat this like an aspirational obituary. We will proceed in the assumption that this is, in fact, the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we are composing the epitaph that will adorn its civilizational tombstone. And with those preambular pleasantries having been dispensed with, we now present for your kind consideration Curmudgeon's Field Guide to the Islamic Republic. Prologue: Revolutions eat their parents. There are two Irans. There is the Iran of Hafez and Ferdowsi, of engineers and filmmakers, of women who filled universities long before it was fashionable to applaud such things, of a civilization older than most European capitals. And then there is the Islamic Republic, a state born in 1979 that grafted a revolutionary clerical ideology onto that civilization and declared itself its sole legitimate interpreter. Those two things are not identical. They have been forced to coexist for nearly half a century. The story we are about to tell is not the story of Persia, nor even, properly, the story of Iran. It is the story of a regime. How it came to power, how it consolidated control, how it financed itself, how it projected influence abroad, how it survived crises that would have felled less determined systems, and how it may yet survive this one. We begin with a misconception. The 1979 revolution was not born Islamist in character. It was born combustible. By the late 1970s, the Shah's Iran was modernizing at a breathtaking pace. Literacy was rising, women had suffrage and legal standing, urbanization was accelerating. Oil revenues were underwriting grand ambitions. It was not Sweden, nobody pretended it was, but it was a state tilting decisively toward secular modernization. And that tilt produced friction. Clerics resented marginalization, leftists resented authoritarianism, bazaar merchants resented economic dislocation, students resented corruption, nationalists resented dependence on Washington. They did not agree on very much, but they did agree on this: the Shah had to go. Revolutions are rarely ideological at birth. They are coalitional. They gather grievances first and sort out the doctrine later. What followed in 1979 was not the inevitable flowering of political Islam. It was the most disciplined faction within a broad revolt, outmaneuvering its temporary allies and reverse engineering a revolution into a theocratic state. And this matters, because when we evaluate the Islamic Republic, we are not evaluating Iran. We are evaluating the faction that captured it. 47 years is long enough to keep score, so let us keep it. Chapter 1, 1979 to 1984, The Hijacking. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran in February 1979 to a hero's welcome. He did not return alone. He returned as the symbolic nucleus of a movement far broader than clerical Islamism. Secular liberals believed he would return to Qom as sort of a moral guide. Marxists believed they could out-organize the clergy. Nationalists believed sovereignty would be restored without theological overhaul. They were all mistaken. Within months, the architecture of the new state began to crystallize. Revolutionary courts dispensing swift justice. Political rivals sidelined or eliminated. A constitutional referendum establishing Velayat-e Faqih, ruled by the Islamic jurists. The creation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, parallel to the regular army. The U.S. Embassy hostage crisis in November 1979 proved catalytic. What began as a student seizure hardened into a 444-day spectacle that unified the country against a foreign adversary and marginalized moderates who urged restraint. Crises consolidate power. Foreign confrontation legitimizes internal purges. And then came the Iran-Iraq War in 1980. Saddam Hussein invaded, calculating that revolutionary chaos had weakened Iran. Instead, the invasion fortified the new regime. 8 years of brutal trench warfare fused nationalism with religious martyrdom. The IRGC expanded from a revolutionary militia into a permanent pillar of the state. War does for fragile regimes what oxygen does for a flame. By 1984, the Islamic Republic had accomplished 3 things: eliminated or neutralized secular revolutionary partners, institutionalized clerical supremacy in constitutional form, and embedded a parallel security apparatus loyal not to the nation, but to the revolution. The hijacking was now complete. Iran had not ceased to exist, but it now operated inside a theological frame enforced by men with guns. Chapter 2, 1985 to 89, War as Foundry. If the early years were about seizure, the mid-1980s were about forging permanence. The Iran-Iraq War dragged on with catastrophic human cost, hundreds of thousands dead, unarmed men sent on human wave attacks against trenches and machine gun nests. Basically the First World War, except twice as horrifying and 10 times as futile. Cities bombarded, chemical weapons deployed, entire generations marked by martyrdom narratives. And within this crucible, the regime refined its governing logic. Sacrifice as virtue, resistance as identity, suspicion of the West as doctrine, revolutionary export as a mission. During this period, Iran cultivated relationships beyond its borders, most notably with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which had emerged amid the chaos of that country's civil war. Whether described as sponsorship, patronage, or alliance, the relationship became one of the defining features of Iran's regional strategy. The model was a clear one: project influence indirectly, empower non-state actors, maintain plausible deniability when convenient. At home, institutions hardened. The Guardian Council gained teeth. The IRGC deepened its economic footprint. The revolutionary state ceased to feel temporary. And then in 1988, Khomeini accepted a ceasefire with Iraq, an act which he likened to drinking poison. The war ended not in triumph, but exhaustion. A year later, Khomeini was dead. Regimes built around charismatic founders often fracture when it's time for succession. The Islamic Republic, regrettably, did not. Ali Khamenei assumed the position of supreme leader. The system endured. By 1989, the revolution had transitioned from upheaval to structure. What began as revolt had become governance. What began as coalition had become clerical hierarchy. What began as idealism had become statecraft. The question from here forward would not be whether the Islamic Republic could seize power. It had done that. The question would be whether it could modernize without surrendering control, and whether its ideological commitments abroad would one day exceed its capacity at home. And we will find out. Chapter 3, 1990 to 94, Reconstruction without repentance. The war ended in exhaustion. The ideology did not. The early 1990s were defined by Reconstruction. President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani pursued economic rehabilitation, infrastructure repair, limited market reforms, cautious reintegration into global energy markets. But Reconstruction was not reform in the Western sense. The constitutional architecture of clerical supremacy remained intact. The Guardian Council retained veto authority. The IRGC did not retreat to the barracks. It expanded into construction, telecommunications, energy, and finance. The revolution professionalized. Internationally, Iran's strategy matured rather than softened. Support for non-state actors in Lebanon continued. Allegations tied Iranian operatives or proxies to attacks abroad during this period, including bombings in Argentina in the early 1990s. Tehran denied direct responsibility. Western and Israeli intelligence services asserted otherwise. The pattern, denial, ambiguity, plausible distance, became familiar. The regime had discovered a durable formula: avoid direct conventional confrontation with major powers, cultivate asymmetric leverage, maintain enough opacity to prevent unified retaliation. Meanwhile, early nuclear research advanced quietly. Publicly framed as civilian energy development, privately viewed by outside observers as hedging toward weapon capability, the program entered what would become a decades-long cycle. Opacity, exposure, negotiation, partial rollback, then resurgence. Reconstruction did not signal ideological retreat, it signaled patience. Chapter 4, 1995 to 99, Reform and the Guardrails. In 1997, Iranians elected Mohammad Khatami in a landslide. It was a remarkable moment. High turnout, youth engagement, women voting in large numbers, talk of a civil society, dialogue among civilizations, and even press freedoms. For a brief period, it appeared that the Islamic Republic might evolve from within. This is where the distinction between Iran and the Islamic Republic becomes unmistakable. Tens of millions of Iranians were not particularly interested in clerical governance. They were interested in normalcy, economic opportunity, cultural expression, less intrusive morality policing, engagement with the wider world. Newspapers flourished, universities buzzed, debate widened, and then the guardrails engaged. The judiciary shuttered reformist publications. The security services cracked down on student protests in 1999. The Guardian Council constrained legislation. Reform proved permissible only so long as it did not threaten the primacy of unelected clerical authority. The system allowed oxygen, but it did not allow surgery. Abroad, tensions persisted. U.S. sanctions intensified under the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act. Naval incidents occurred intermittently in the Persian Gulf, including harassment of foreign vessels. Even in the 1990s, Iran tested the boundaries of freedom of navigation in international waters, shadowing ships, conducting aggressive maneuvers, probing how far it could push without triggering escalation. These were not accidents, they were signals. The regime had internal reformist pressure and external confrontational pressure. It responded to both in the same way, incrementally, calculated, never conceding core authority. By the end of the decade, reformist optimism had dimmed, but not quite vanished. The population had revealed its preferences. The system had revealed its limits. Chapter 5, 2000 to 2004, Nuclear Shadows. In 2002, previously undisclosed nuclear facilities at Natanz and Iraq were revealed by opposition sources. What had long become suspected became concrete. Iran insisted the program was peaceful and within its rights under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. European governments initiated negotiations. The United States, particularly after September 11th and the invasion of Iraq, viewed the matter through a bit of a more severe lens. In 2002, President George W. Bush included Iran in the axis of evil. That phrase hardened positions in Tehran and Washington alike. From here forward, the nuclear file would become the regime's most valuable bargaining chip, and a pattern emerged. Advance capability, deny weaponization intent, enter negotiations under pressure, agree to partial constraints, secure sanctions relief or financial access, and preserve long-term leverage. Critics called it deception. Supporters called it strategic patience. Either way, it worked often enough to be repeated. Regionally, Iran's asymmetric posture deepened. Following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Tehran gained extraordinary strategic opportunity. Saddam Hussein, its former invader, was gone. Political vacuums opened, militias proliferated, influence networks expanded. This was not accidental opportunism, it was structural advantage. At sea, harassment incidents continued episodically, small fast attack craft, close passes, occasional detentions of foreign sailors in disputed waters, each event individually minor, but collectively illustrative. A serious great power protects freedom of navigation as a stabilizing principle of global commerce. A revolutionary regime treats maritime friction as leverage. By 2004, the Islamic Republic stood at a paradoxical position. Economically constrained, militarily conventionally limited, asymmetrically empowered, nuclear ambiguous, domestically divided, but structurally stable. The revolution had not mellowed with age, but it had learned. Chapter 6, 2005-2009, Confrontation and the Street. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president. If the late 1990s had flirted with reformist optimism, the mid-2000s returned to ideological confrontation. Ahmadinejad's rhetoric was abrasive, particularly toward Israel. His posture toward the West was defiant. The nuclear program accelerated. Centrifuges spun. International concern hardened into coordinated sanctions. The UN Security Council imposed successive rounds of penalties targeting banking, arms transfers, and nuclear-related entities. Economic pressure intensified. And yet the regime did not retreat. The nuclear file was no longer merely a scientific endeavor, it was a sovereignty narrative. To yield under pressure would signal weakness. To advance under sanctions signaled resilience. And then came 2009. Ahmadinejad was declared the winner of a contested election. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets under the banner of what became known as the Green Movement. The images were unmistakable. Young, urban, connected, chanting for votes to be counted. Women, visible and social. Citizens not calling for foreign intervention, but for internal legitimacy. Here again, the distinction between Iran and the Islamic Republic sharpened. The protesters were not foreign agents. They were not fringe radicals. They were engineers, students, mothers, shopkeepers. They were the demographic reality of a country whose median age had collapsed downward since 1979. The system responded with force. Security services suppressed demonstrations. Leaders were placed under house arrest. Media space narrowed. The guardrails did not bend. And it is worth pausing here. For nearly 3 decades, the Islamic Republic had maintained a consistent operating principle. Permit controlled participation, deny structural change. By 2009, that principle was fully exposed. Abroad, meanwhile, maritime friction persisted. Harassment of commercial shipping in the Gulf, confrontations with U.S. naval vessels, and episodic detentions of foreign sailors reinforced a broader pattern. Calibrated brinkmanship designed to remind the world that key energy choke points sat within Iran's reach. No single incident constituted war. Collectively, though, they underscored leverage. By the end of this period, the regime was internationally isolated, economically pressured, domestically uneasy, and yet still intact. Chapter 7, 2010 to 14, Sanctions, Strategy, and the Wager. The sanctions tightened. Targeted measures escalated into sweeping financial restrictions. Iranian oil exports declined sharply. Access to the global banking system was constricted. Inflation surged. The currency faltered. Economic pain became visible. But economic pain alone does not guarantee political transformation. Authoritarian systems often distribute hardship unevenly, protecting core supporters while diffusing cost across the broader population. It was in this climate that Hassan Rouhani, a relative moderate within the Iranian system, was elected president in 2013. Behind the scenes, negotiations intensified. The wager, particularly in Washington and several European capitals, was straightforward. If sufficient economic incentive were provided, the regime would accept durable limits on its nuclear program in exchange for reintegration into global markets. It was not really an irrational wager, it was more of a foolishly optimistic one. This culminated in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the Obama nuclear deal. In exchange for verifiable limits on enrichment levels, centrifuge counts, and stockpiles, sanctions relief would follow. Supporters argued it blocked the path to a bomb. Critics argued that it deferred rather than dismantled it. Both sides understood one thing: the nuclear file was the regime's primary bargaining chip. And here we must observe the longer pattern. For decades, nuclear advancement had functioned not merely as a weapons hedge, but as financial leverage. Advanced capability, trigger pressure, negotiate partial rollbacks, secure relief, preserve optionality. Whether one views this as pragmatic statecraft or cyclical bad faith depends largely on one's expectations of revolutionary regimes. Meanwhile, Iran's regional footprint expanded. In Iraq, Shia militias deepened influence. In Syria, Tehran backed the Assad regime decisively. In Lebanon, Hezbollah remained entrenched. In Yemen, support flowed toward the Houthis. None of this was subtle. This was not the behavior of a state content with internal consolidation alone. It was the behavior of a regime convinced that exporting influence was essential to its survival. At sea, freedom of navigation tensions continued episodically. Harassment, vessel seizures, signaling maneuvers. Each small event, not enough to trigger a general war, large enough to remind global energy markets that the Strait of Hormuz remained a pressure point. By 2014, the Islamic Republic stood at an inflection point. Economically strained, diplomatically engaged, regionally assertive, nuclear constrained on paper, nuclear capable in knowledge. The wager had been placed. Whether it would hold was another matter entirely. Chapter 8, 2015 to 19. Money in, pressure back. The JCPOA took effect in 2015. Sanctions relief followed in the form of big pellets of U.S. taxpayer cash. Frozen assets were released. Oil exports rebounded. European firms explored re-entry into Iranian markets. The currency stabilized. Briefly. Supporters of the deal argued that integration would moderate behavior over time, that a regime with something to lose would behave differently than one permanently besieged. But moderation did not arrive in sweeping form. Regionally, Iran influence did not contract, rather it expanded. In Syria, Iranian forces and proxies played a decisive role in preserving Bashar al-Assad's government. In Iraq, Shia militias with varying degrees of Tehran alignment solidified political and military clout. In Lebanon, Hezbollah remained both political actor and armed force. In Yemen, support for the Houthis contributed to a grinding regional conflict. The nuclear file was partially constrained. The regional file was not. Critics seized on this asymmetry. They argued that sanctions relief had freed resources that strengthened Tehran's external posture while leaving the regime's internal character unchanged. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA under the Trump administration and reimposed sanctions under a maximum pressure strategy. The logic was inverted. Economic strangulation would force broader concessions. Tehran responded by gradually breaching certain nuclear limits, incrementally increasing enrichment levels and stockpiles while insisting that the steps were reversible. The familiar rhythm resumed. Pressure, then escalation, then negotiation signals, then partial rollback, and then renewed pressure, rinse and repeat. Meanwhile, maritime incidents intensified periodically. Tankers were seized or detained in disputed waters. Commercial vessels were harassed. The Strait of Hormuz once again functioned as geopolitical punctuation. Freedom of navigation is not a symbolic principle. It is the circulatory system of global energy markets. Interference with it, even episodic interference, introduces volatility by design. These actions were rarely large enough to trigger sustained armed response, but they were rarely accidental. By 2019, the JCPOA framework was fraying. Sanctions were biting again. The nuclear clock was no longer comfortably distant. The wager had not failed entirely, but it had not transformed the regime either. Chapter 9, 2020 to 24, Brittleness and Force. In January 2020, a U.S. drone strike killed Qasem Soleimani, commander of the IRGC's Quds Force. Soleimani had been central to Iran's regional projection strategy, a strategist of asymmetric influence across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. His death marked one of the most direct escalatory exchanges between Washington and Tehran in decades. Retaliatory strikes followed. Both sides stepped back from full war. The pattern held. Calibrated confrontation without total rupture. And then came a different kind of challenge. In 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini in the custody of morality police sparked nationwide protests under the slogan, Woman, Life, Freedom. The demonstrations were not limited to one class or to one city. They cut across provinces. Women removed headscarves publicly. Young men confronted security forces. Workers struck. Ethnic minorities mobilized. It was the most sustained domestic challenge to clerical authority in years. And once again, the distinction between Iran and the Islamic Republic was visible to anyone willing to see it. Tens of millions of Iranians are not particularly religious. Many women remember or have been told by their mothers and grandmothers that their rights once flowed from citizenship and not from clerical interpretation. The regime responded predictably. Arrests, uses of force, executions, information control. Brittle regimes often appear strongest at the moment of suppression. The durability question continues to linger underneath. Externally, regional friction continued. Proxy networks remained active. Maritime confrontations persisted. Missile and drone capabilities advanced. And now, in the past days, direct hostilities have escalated to a degree not seen in years. We will not pretend to know whether this is wise or unwise, stabilizing or destabilizing. Such judgments depend on outcomes that are not yet written. Nor will we declare that this is the end of the Islamic Republic. Regimes built on ideology and coercive capacity do not evaporate on cue. Some collapse suddenly, others absorb shocks far beyond what outside observers expect them to. But we can say this: the Islamic Republic today is not the revolutionary furnace of 1979. It is an aging system managing economic strain, demographic impatience, technological leakage, and geopolitical overextension. It is both hardened and brittle. Whether the events of this week mark an obituary or merely another chapter in survival remains unknowable at this remove, because we were not born yesterday. Epilogue: Regime, Nation, and the Long Horizon. 47 years is long enough to evaluate patterns. The Islamic Republic began as one faction within a broader revolt. It consolidated power through crisis. It institutionalized clerical supremacy. It cultivated asymmetric regional influence. It leveraged nuclear ambiguity for strategic and financial gain. It tested maritime norms without fully crossing into declared war. It suppressed internal reform when reform threatened structural authority. It has been designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism since 1984. Faced sanctions for decades. It has outlasted multiple American administrations and multiple predictions of imminent collapse. And yet, here we are. Iran is not reducible to its ruling structure. It is a country of poets, coders, entrepreneurs, skeptics, devout believers, secularists, mothers who remember different laws, daughters who imagine different futures. When great powers evaluate regimes, they often confront unpleasant choices: support imperfect partners, or risk more radical alternatives; apply pressure, or risk proliferation; engage diplomatically, or risk isolation. There are no clean hands in geopolitics. There are only gradients of risk. The Islamic Republic chose confrontation as identity. It chose clerical supremacy as constitutional design. It chose nuclear ambiguity as leverage. It chose maritime friction as signaling. It chose proxy networks as force multipliers. History keeps score. Whether this moment marks the closing of the account or merely another line item remains to be seen. We hope for the sake of the Iranian people that the future belongs more to Iran than to the republic that captured it. But hope is not analysis, and analysis is what we owe. And with that, we close the book on this week's Field Guide. We wish Godspeed to all of our service members for their courage and skill and intrepidity and dedication. We wish them a successful mission and a safe return. We honor the sacrifice of those who have fallen, and fervently do we pray that they gave the last full measure of devotion in service of a cause that proves to have changed the world for the better. And I now duly transmit you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.